that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really, one has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
You're listening to The Fromm Connection, a casual, conversational podcast about the ideas of social philosopher Erich Fromm and how they apply today. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America. For more information about the Erich Fromm Society of North America, visit www.erichfrommna.com, or you can send an email to erichfrommna@proton.me. The views expressed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Erich Fromm Society of North America, but those of the friends and scholars who appreciate his work. On behalf of my fellow podcast hosts, Kike Autry and Rudy McCormack, I'm Lacey Delane Hunt. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the show. We want to welcome everybody to the Fromm Connection. This is a podcast, of course, by the Fromm Society of North America. I'm Lacey Delane.
And I'm Rudy Leo McCormack.
We are super happy to have you guys today. Our topic is human nature. Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever argued with anyone about it? We don't have a human nature that's universal. Yes, we do. What is it? Can we define it? What did Fromm say about that? Today we have Mauricio Cortina here with us to discuss this. I'm super excited about this. Mauricio has interacted, he has heard Fromm speak himself in person. That is so cool. So I'm super excited to hear you, Mauricio, if you would be willing to introduce yourself, let us know a little bit about who you are, and we will get started.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. So let me say a little bit about myself and how I got acquainted with Fromm's work. I am Mexican, and my father worked off and on for the Mexican government. And I was in the United States from age 2 to 7, which is why I don't have an accent. So I pass as a white, and most people think I'm a Mexican American, but I went back to Mexico when I was 7 years old and stayed there till I graduated from medical school from the National University of Mexico. And the National University and the medical school was associated with the Psychoanalytic Institute that Fromm had created in Mexico. Fromm was in Mexico for some 20-some years. So he had a big influence. And a group of us, while we were in medical school, started reading Erich Fromm's work. And we got really, really excited. There was 3 of us, and we said, "This is really cool," and say, "Why don't we join the Psychoanalytic Institute, which was just adjacent to the university, had a clinic, low-fee clinic. So why don't we become patients at the clinic and do an analysis?" So we joined the psychoanalytic clinic, and I was in therapy there a couple of years with a therapist. But reading Fromm really had a huge impact in my life, because it really oriented me in terms of my sense of ethics, and particularly his humanism. His radical brand of humanism was my spiritual guidance at that point. Now, I'm I'm for people who know about Mexico history, I would be considered the generation of '68. In '68, there was a huge there was a huge student movement that followed the French student movement in May, and we were very influenced by them. And and it really started gathering storm, and it was asking for a freedom for the press not to be sold by the Mexican government, and it was asking for the liberation of political prisoners, and it was gaining steam started gaining steam among the middle class. So that was by the fall of 1968. Mexico was hosting the Olympics in November of '68. You remember that there was this famous black athlete that did this movement of raising his fist. Well, they didn't want to have the Olympics in the middle of a major movement that was going on in Mexico. So the president ordered what was equivalent to our Tiananmen Square. And in one of the meetings we had that I luckily didn't attend, 500 students were machine gunned. So, and that's my generation. I was part of that student movement. And so as soon as, reading Fromm was really helped me, oriented me, but I was planning to do a residency. Fromm was the reason why I changed from maybe becoming an internist or even doing some science, medical science, to really want to become a psychoanalyst. So I came to the United States to do a residency at Menninger's, and thinking I would go back to Mexico after that, but for a variety of reasons, I stayed in the United States. And I was telling Lacey that I lived most of my adult life here in the United States. So that was that's a little bit about me. My father was a generation that came after the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, and his generation of lawyers, he graduated in the late '60s. One was a president. So they formed, that generation really created the post-Mexican Revolution. And so it was a very idealistic sort of background I came from, with the history. And like all revolutions, the Mexican Revolution was betrayed. And we developed a type of government that was very close to a communist, except it wasn't so brutal and so repressive, but the government had complete control over everything. That's what really started the student revolution. So this is a little bit to say about myself, and to say about why I became so interested in the question of human nature, because Fromm's view of humanism is based on understanding the existential conditions of human, what made us humans. And he was one of the few analysts of his generation that really, other than Freud, that really tried to develop an evolutionary view of what made us human. There's a real paradox in human nature that has puzzled generations of people through centuries. The paradox is the following: how can we claim there is a human nature where what we see historically is that humans become transformed historically and culturally in so many different ways? So how can you claim there's a human nature where there's all kind of expressions of what it means to be human, depending on the culture and the historical time you came? So how do you reconcile those two things? It's been a real puzzle. I think the distinction that Fromm and many of the people from the Enlightenment made was similar to what Marx said, that there's human nature in general and human nature as it is transformed historically through time. So how can we know there's some basic human needs and human nature that that make us one race, one human species? Well, part of understanding the paradox are two things. The first, it has been a real change in how we understand human evolution in general. And the change has been the following. It's not that we have two forms of inheritance, actually. A genetic inheritance based on DNA, that we have with all other species. But we have another form of inheritance, which is the cultural accumulation of knowledge through thousands of years. And it's a very faithful accumulative process through thousands of years. So this cumulative transformation of knowledge from one historical period to other, from one culture to other, has created enormous diversity of human needs. We have to adapt to the culture in which we grow up. Because we have no other option. Humans are the one species in which we create, well, beavers do that and some other species, but we create the own environment in which we must live. So we create the environments in which we must live, which is why we're different. But the heredity by the accumulation of culture affects genes too. A common example is when we domesticated cows. Now, babies and toddlers have lactate enzyme who allows them to digest mother's milk. But it turns off after 3 years of life because you don't need it, after babies became weaned. Well, when we domesticated cows and we could, and there was strong selective pressures to be able to drink that milk. So what happened? There were selective pressures that allowed the lactate hormone to continue to function late into development. So we could drink milk. So this is a classical example of how culture evolution and the invention of agriculture starts having effects on genetic evolution. So they're together. Now, I want to read something to first understand what Fromm's view of the human condition and human nature and what he got right and what he got wrong. So what I'm going to read you from is from his second book he wrote, Man for Himself, that came after Escape from Freedom. Escape from Freedom, by the way, was written in 1941, and it was really what made Fromm famous because he was the only analyst of his generation who tried to understand the rise of Nazi phenomena, So it was a historical analysis of the transformation from the medieval societies to the emergence of capitalism, and gave rise to two different historical trends. One was to greater emancipation from the bonds of feudalism and greater freedom, and the other was toward greater the fear that freedom generated to look for authoritarian leaders that would be able to give a sense of identity of who we were. And he analyzed Nazism as a return to that kind of security. Now, there were historical reasons why Nazi emerged. The Germans had been defeated in the Second World War. There was a great sense of national humiliation. There was a huge economic crisis and inflation, which which really affected the workers of of Germany and Fortin. And under those conditions, Hitler was able to exploit those humiliation and the economic vulnerability, making a scapegoat out of the Jews. You know, the Jews were responsible for why we lost the Second World. The Jews are responsible for the economic crisis we're in. So he made a scapegoat out of Jews, not unlike what Trump is doing and scapegoating immigrants in this country and also exploiting vulnerabilities in this country. So, okay, so let's go back. I just wanted to give a little bit of background on Escape from Freedom and why it was such an important book and really brought Fromm to his next book, which was Man for Himself. And that's where he first developed his sense of a biological explanation, evolutionary explanation of what made us humans. And I'll just read from a couple things from the book. The title of this is Man's Biological Weakness. The first element that differentiates human from animals' existence is a negative one, the relatively absence of man of instinctive regulation in the process of adaptation and the surrounding of the world. The second characteristic is that man is the most helpless of all animals, but this very biological weaknesses is the basis for his strength, the prime cause for the development of his specific human qualities. And together with a decrease in instincts that determine behavior, humans had to create a substitute for that, which what Fromm found was culture. That gave us a sense of meaning and purpose and oriented to life. So Fromm saw becoming humans as a break with the instinctual equipment that made us human, together with the development of the neocortex. We have a huge neocortex, the biggest neocortex of any species, and the most prolonged development of any other species. So you put these together, and you have the makings of an existential condition. Based on that, Fromm made a list of basic human needs, and he modified those basic human needs later in development. The first basic need that he thought was universal was what he called the need for a frame of orientation and devotion. That there is no culture, he points out, in which humans have not tried to create a sense of meaning of their place of universe and where they come from. So we created concepts of God, we created idols, we created systems of meaning or belief. Some were theistic, some later on were non-theistic. Let me turn this off just a minute. Sorry about my phone. So that's one thing that's a basic human need that is specifically human, where we could characterize what made us human is life becoming aware of itself. There's a first phenomena in human biological evolution where there's a creature, humans, who become conscious of their own existence and of their own death. You know, and this creates a need, a basic need to give some sense of meaning and purpose to our life and sense of orientation.
So Dr. Mauricio, I just wanted to ask, maybe just to get a little more of a personal take here. You said you spoke, or you said earlier that you have spoken to Dr. Fromm when he was alive. Did you ever speak to him, how he came up with some of these ideas himself, and how he recognized like relatedness as being like this huge aspect of kind of like some of the paradoxes that you were talking about throughout Man for Himself, that he kind of uncovered, or how was it that he was able to think about these things in the way that he did?
So there's two questions here. What was my connection with Fromm?
Mm-hmm.
Well, part of it is that I started reading his books when I was in medical school, but I was so taken by his work that when I finished medical school, I came to Washington to work with Michael Maccabee. Now, Michael Maccabee spent 9 years in Mexico. He was a Harvard-trained psychologist and anthropologist, and Fromm was doing a study of social character, one of his main concepts in terms of understanding society and culture. And he did a study of social character, and the deal was that he would become his research assistant to do this study if he was analyzed by Fromm and graduated from the Frommian Institute. So that was the deal. So since I was so interested in Fromm's work, and he, by the time I finished medical school in the late 70s at Menninger's, he had left Mexico and he was in Sweden. I decided to come and visit Michael Maccabee in Washington and see if I could work with him. So I decided that I would work with him, and I would do my personal analysis with him. So during my personal analysis and my collaboration with Michael Maccabee, where we edited several books together. In fact, we edited one of the first books that came out in the early 80s of Fromm. It's called A Prophetic Analyst, Fromm's Contributions to Psychoanalysis. That book was published in about 22, 23 years ago. So I started working with him on projects like that. And I heard a lot of stories about his own analysis with Fromm. So I got, in a sense, I'm a second generation Frommian.
Awesome.
But it was his humanism that really was, aside from his two main contributions from my point of view, is his humanism as an ethical view of society. And humanism has two main concepts. One, that we are one species. Racism is a social construction. The genetic differences between humans around the world are tiny. The culture difference, as I say, are enormous, and this is the paradox.
Right.
But the genetic differences are very, very small. So we're one species. The second main premises of radical humanism is the aim of development and the aim of societies should be the fulfillment of human beings, their potential to become whoever they were at their best, to bring out the better angels of our nature, to use Lincoln's famous concept. That was the function of the philosophy of humanism, is to recognize that despite our enormous differences in terms of cultures and languages, we are much more alike than otherwise. And the second main premise is that the purpose of society, as I just said, is to bring out the best in us, to bring out the better angels of our nature. And obviously, we have a genius for good and evil, And how do you understand that we have both the capacity to be loving, caring, to care about our children, to care about our neighbors, and at the same time, we're the most destructive animal in the world? How do you understand that paradox? Well, that's a question that really, really interested me and that interested Fromm. And the answer goes back to his view of human nature. I think we have not lost our instincts, as Fromm believed. And what really led me to understand that was my becoming aware and started reading Bowlby and Ainsworth and the whole attachment research. Now, what Bowlby's view of attachment came from ethologists, animal people who study other species. And they had described attachment bonds among many mammals and some species. So just like humans and babies have a need to find security among an attachment figure, often because historically and our patriarchy it's been the mother, the biological mother, but it can be anybody who's the main caregiver of the infant. The infant is instinctively moved to seek protection and care from attachment figures, and there might be 2 or 3 in a hierarchy. So that's a very strong instinct. We didn't lose that instinct.
And that is a popular thing now. I mean, that is something in psychological circles we are learning and hearing more and more about, which we hadn't years ago.
Which we hadn't. And it's something that has helped us understand what we didn't have before is the view of normal development. Because there's longitudinal studies that have seen what happens with babies who have a secure attachment to 1 or 2 attachment figures and babies who have insecure or even disorganized attachment to attachment figures. And we know that the impact of the attachment bond in early infant childhood and beyond childhood has enormous impact on development. So that children who have a secure attachment, have developed positive expectations that their attachment figures will be available and will see them where needed. And that liberates them to explore the social world the social and cultural and material world in which they live. So the attachment bond is what creates the freedom for children to be able to explore not only the external world, but also to become more open to understand the internal world. Well, attachment theory helped me realize that no, we have social things. There is more continuity in between humans and other species that Fromm recognized. The discontinuities are really cognitive and social. The other main instinct we share with other species is sort of a herd instinct. Mammals, elephants, dolphins live in groups. Humans, in order to survive, had to learn in groups during the prehistory of our species that goes back 2 million years, with the first first primitive human, Homo erectus, which appears 2 million years ago. These humans that lived in Africa were in the midst of major climate changes because of the ice ages, from very wet to very dry weather. They had to leave the forest environments in which our great ape relatives lived, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, to start exploring the African savanna. They had already become bipedal. So how could they survive when there were predators like the cats, the lions, which were much stronger and much ferocious predators than? Well, we survived by staying in groups.
Working together, collaboration.
By collaboration. We had to collaborate in small groups of hunter-gatherers, and our group became as important for survival as the attachment bonds are important for survival. Because as Bobby said, the reason why animals have attachment bonds is because it promotes survival, protect from predators and other dangers. Right. That's what mothers do. Reptiles who do not have the social instinct, what do they do when they're in danger? They either fight or flight or freeze. Mm-hmm. Humans go to another human being. They're attached.
It seems obvious to me that we wouldn't have survived as long as we have as a species if we were competitive and I'm better than you, and as much as our culture now promotes that more than it does the collaboration. We wouldn't have made it to here if we weren't collaborative for those so many years.
So for 2 million years, where we have the first primitive humans, Homo erectus, we lived in small groups of nomadic hunters of 30, 40 people. Here's the really interesting stuff. There's a primatologist and anthropologist called Christopher Boehm, who has several books about our transition, about the egalitarianism that is found in hunter-gatherers. And here's what's really interesting. So in the last 100 years, anthropologists had studied the few hunter-gatherer societies that still exist. And he selected a group of hunter-gatherers that had been less exposed to the modern world and to agriculture. And he looked at the ethnographies that have been accumulated by anthropologists and all. So despite living in radically different environments, the Arctic, the African savanna, the Amazons, etc., they have one thing in common. They're fiercely egalitarian. And it makes sense. You know, they will not allow a big shot to accumulate the wealth of the tribe. Or if he goes hunting, he has to bring back what he hunts and share it with the rest of the tribe. If not, they wouldn't survive. So it's a sharing culture, and we had this sharing culture for over 2 million years. It only starts changing, and that goes back to your issue of the competition. It only starts changing just 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, or 15,000 years ago, we've developed sedentary populations that because we invent agriculture.
Yep.
And we become sedentary animals. And then 5 millennia later, we have the big civilizations in Mesopotamia, which is strongly hierarchical. So we went from being strongly egalitarian to create societies that, because of their complexities, started developing hierarchies. And when the hierarchies, you get inequalities, and when inequalities, you get powerful elites that control society. And so
part of me starts to I'm wondering whether, you know, there's like a tension between this sort of paradox of abstractification, which is something that, you know, we see now today, you know, everywhere, and then also this idea of, well, I guess along with the abstractification, the alienation of the things we see in our society, or the things we experience in our society, because I think we see less and less of, you know, how we produce the things that we experience in our society. And I think part of that has to do with the abstractification of how we experience the world. Right?
There's two things that come with the abstractification. Let's go back to feudal societies. Okay. Feudal societies, the idea of acquisition was completely foreign to them. You know, in fact, usury was one of their main crimes. So what changed between feudal societies and the societies we live now? Capitalism. Capitalism is based on the view that if everybody follows their own selfish interest, everybody will profit by them. You know, it's based on an acquisitive, self-interest, competitive model of society. You know, so this model of society, where competition and acquisitiveness predominates, was also developing among societies that had become highly hierarchical with tyrants. So,
right.
But capitalism also requires a degree of abstractification that is very different from the type of labor work of a feudal society, where you're craftsmen, you're agriculture, you see what you do.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. You see the whole process through.
We see the whole process through. Now the whole process is fragmented. We just see little pieces of it. It's highly abstract. It can be put in mathematical terms, you know. So that's part of the development of capitalism, you know, this abstractification. So does that start addressing the question you were asking me, Rudy?
Yes. Honestly, and it leads me to want to ask more, because there's, you know, the rise of AI and these new technologies that we're now experiencing. I'm wondering here if maybe there's a space here to talk about how all these new technologies are they changing our nature? Is human nature changing? Are we adapting
Hmm.
to a kind of helplessness, right? To a sense of we don't even know how to be human anymore. You see where I'm getting at? Because of how abstract and quantified and just separated we are from everything that we do
Yes.
now.
Wow.
So
That,
there's both tendencies. Okay. But still, the need for all of us to care for our families, to care for our children, to care for our neighbors, you know, to live in communities has not completely been eroded by capitalism.
True.
In some areas in the big cities and so forth, it has changed a great deal. And we live now in families that are um, two parents, and they're isolated from their families that used to be the support. And it's we've human children have never grown up in those environments. Children
Right.
for millions of years grew up in environments where it takes a village to create a child. you
And
know
maybe they had multiple attachment,
they had
involved attachment
multiple
points.
caregivers, the
Yes.
grandmother, the older sister, because they were small societies. There's a book by Sarah Hardy that called Mothers and Others that talks about that. She calls them alloparents.
Yes.
You know, there's there's many species, and humans are one of them, where where mothers are not the only providers of care.
Yes.
Here's an interesting difference with chimpanzees and bonobos and our great ape relatives. They are, those mothers do not let any other member of the group get near their babies because of the high rates of infanticide. So there was a huge transformation from the chimpanzees, whose mothers are the sole protectors of babies during the first 6 months, to a society where alloparenting became necessary to survive. Because why? Because you had infants that had this huge development that had to be socialized, and there was no way that a mother by herself could take care of this infant who consumes enormous amount of energy just because he has this huge brain. Our human brain consumes 60 or 70% of the energy that goes to infants' nutritional needs goes to the brain because it's growing at exponential levels. Our
Yes.
brain consumes enormous amount of energy. There's no way that a mother by herself could survive under this condition. So alloparenting has been the norm. So we live in very anomalous human environments compared to the 2 million years in which we lived as small groups of hunter gatherers.
I imagine this whole AI and all the technology complicates that even further.
Complicates that even further. And now we have the possibility with CRISP technologies that can modify genetic codes that we could start messing around with that and create what you were saying, Rudy. But as Franz said, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it, because it
Right.
could transform human nature. And that's a barrier we should not stop. Now, there are clear laws that prohibit the use of CRISP technologies to do that, But here, once again, we're getting to a point where we can modify our biological nature in ways that would have been undreamt before. And again, I go to the issue of the cultural evolution that it's not been one or two geniuses that transform our scientific and our worldview. It's been thousands of generations that have been accumulated knowledge from one generation to other. That's what makes us different. That's what allows us to go to the moon, to create the internet, to create these biologies, this enormous accumulation of knowledge.
Mm.
Not only technological and scientific, but cultural too.
I think, along with what you're saying, Rudy, is the idea, Mauricio, of the pathology of normalcy. I'd love for us to get into that a little bit before we're wrapping up here in the next 15, 20 minutes, but would love to touch on the pathology of normalcy a little bit.
Yes. Well, it goes back to what we were talking about of the transformation of capitalism and the criticism Fromm made about how capitalism was alienating human beings because we were more and more distant to the products we were creating. This was basically Marxist criticism, you know, of alienation and of capitalism. And he wrote a book, The Sane Society, written in the middle of the 1950s, where he talked about the pathology of normalcy. And Fromm was really troubled by the fact that we were moving more and more into this technological, consumeristic society that was accommodating to the huge corporations, and where we were losing our individuality. And we were buying into this consumeristic, wrong view about what human nature is really about. You know, we bought into the economic view that markets are the solution to all the problems, and if we just liberate markets, you know, take care of everybody. Well, we know that's not true. It wasn't so true during the 50s, where there was a huge economic development post-World War and a creating of the biggest middle-class society the world has ever known. There was a huge age of prosperity. But in the last 40, 50 years, we've gone back to a more virulent form of capitalism, where neoliberal policies, international trade, globalization has created huge inequalities, social inequalities. Fromm called the pathology of normalcy this consumeristic view, this view of what was important in life and the acquisitiveness of it and the conformity, the herd conformity. And he said, just because everybody is comfortable with that and believe in that doesn't mean it's not sick. So as we have individual pathologies, we can have sick social pathologies. And the reason we don't recognize them as social pathologies is because we all accept them as normal. You know, if we all share the same values, you know, and we all think that these values have humans have always been part. These values are universal. Then we don't recognize that these values that make us sick are pathology. So there are a lot.
And I think that has something to do with our psychological development as a species, because one of the things that, you know, in psychology, they say it's better, maybe not psychology, but at least in popular culture, you know, better the devil you know than the heaven you don't, right? And then there's a sense of an attachment, and since you were talking about attachments, of becoming attached to the things that we're familiar with, even though they may cause us harm, right? I think that's the paradox there that we constantly dance with.
So I want to talk about what the pathology of normalcy is that's going on now. What would Fromm think of what's happening in the 21st century with the emergence, which he would have probably never anticipated, of new forms of neo-Nazism and right-wing authoritarianism? Also some left-wing authoritarianism too, but mostly the danger is the right wing, and leaders like Trump that exploit the vulnerabilities of people and create followers. I think that part of the pathology of normalcy is if we've accepted that we live in different tribes, you know, and leaders like Trump and Hitler precisely understood that we were tribal enemies and that we could dehumanize a group, scapegoat a group, and make them into the enemy. So part of the pathology of that we're seeing right now in society is this enormous divisiveness that is created by right-wing leaders who exploit that in order those divisions in order to to get the following of people that see these leaders as their saviors, like a lot of Trump voters see Trump as a savior, you know, because he speaks to the issues and their vulnerabilities. We have to give credit to Trump, and he speaks to the fact that this neoliberal policies that were adopted by the Democrats and by Clinton and even by Obama did not help the working class, you know. We're worse off. The American dream. Somebody said you have to be dreaming to believe that you still believe in the American dream. You know, there is no American dream. You know, we don't.
I think that was
better off than us. So I think, you know, one of the enormous social pathologies we're living is that this divisiveness that is made worse by the fact that we get our information now through the internet, and everybody has their little bubble of information where we don't have a common form of information like we had in the generation of the 50s and 60s, that you could say Cronkite and he would sort of be somebody everybody believed was believable, and there was a common sense of understanding of what reality was. Now reality is divided according to what tribe you live in.
And the algorithms that are feeding into that tribe, right?
The algorithms are feeding into that, you know. So there's all these positive feedbacks that are feeding into this pathology, you know, and allowing us not to be able to address the huge issues of inequality and climate change that are existential threats.
Right.
I think the pace of life would be one that I would imagine would fall into this category of the pathology of normalcy. I mean, our work hours are insane. We're so far away from each other. We don't have as much time as we did for the millions of years that we developed as a species to be together, to nurture each other, to love each other, as Fromm talks about in The Art of Loving, to build the relationships that we so long for. I would think that would be encompassed in the pathology of normalcy as well.
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of things that could be we thought about, and that one you're right on. I mean, we've become workaholics and careerists, you know.
Yeah.
And there's starting to be a movement against that, you know, because we're realizing the enormous human costs of that, you know. But there's so many things that are working against us. Women started being in the workplace, and big time 40, 50 years ago started that. We need childcare, you know. We only the very upper 10% of the population can really afford the childcare. We don't have the social supports to nurture families, allow them to have time to be together and not work themselves off. Like the 50%, the inequalities have become so brutal that less than 1% of American billionaires own more money than the 50% of the lowest part of American society. They have more money than 160 million Americans, just 0.1%. That's how unequal we have become. And that's another pathology. You know, we accept these inequalities as being necessary for the economy to grow. You know, we think that that's necessary.
I mean, we also accept it too, just because we can't see it. Like, when was the last time you saw the 0.1% just walking around your neighborhood? You know,
you don't see them. You know,
you don't see them. You don't see them at all. And I think that's part of it too, right? It's the guise and the veils, right, that exist that don't allow us to actually give us a more comprehensive understanding these forms of inequalities and pathologies you're talking about. Because I mean, I've shown figures, for example, to my students, with videos of showing them like the actual metrics of how much wealth is actually accumulated by the 0.1%. And a lot of them come out of class a little blown away. They're like, "Wait, what? Like this is." Because it even talks about there's a video that talks about like what the Americans think the ideal stratification of society looks like, or what it should be, and then what it actually is, and even what Americans imagine our inequality to be is nothing to compare to the dystopian reality that we actually have.
Dang.
And that really messes with
And that's a big change from the Fromm that wrote The Society in the middle 50s. In the middle 50s, during the Eisenhower administration, the richest 1% or 10% Americans paid 90% in taxes. Now, when you tell that to people, they don't believe it.
Yeah.
And economics would say that would destroy productivity. But we were most productive when we were really growing the economy and we were moving to greater equality. That stopped 40, 50 years ago with the Reagan revolution, with neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera. We've gone backwards.
That reminds me of something I'm super passionate about, which is universal basic income. And I know Fromm wrote about universal basic income and was an advocate for that in the book, To Have or to Be, The Sane Society. How do we fix this? If people don't have money to spend, the capitalistic system can't work too well.
Well, my hope is that we're in such a crisis, like in the 1930s, where post First World War, the Great Depression, it created Roosevelt came to power, and we had the most progressive 10 or 15 years in the United States because of the crisis of capitalism, And I think we're reaching a similar point that we cannot continue in this way. We cannot let the climate get worse. Things are going to get so bad that there has to be a crisis. And we have to have, and I want to end on this hopeful note, we have to imagine and think of policies like a basic income from everybody, which would deal with the welfare state and degrading people who get welfare. Everybody would have that, because they're not going to be the jobs anyway because of AI and etc. So people will have the basic income, so they don't have to be worried about how they live, and the social networks and the child care and so forth. We have to move in that direction, and there are many people who are moving in that direction, and we don't hear about it. Let me give you just an example. Can you imagine a society where children up to the age of 10 or 11 are not instructed, they're allowed to play, and they're allowed to socialize? Well, that's happened in Finland. And when you study these kids, who are not exposed to exams all the time, and you do tests when they're 18 or 19, they score higher than the testing kids that of our educational system. So there are experiments like that going on, and we don't hear about that.
There's a lot of universal basic income pilots that have been wildly successful as well.
Wildly successful, and it's been supported by the right too. I just edited a little bit of self-promotion here. I just edited for a psychoanalytic journal an issue that's called Erich Fromm's Relevance for Our Troubled World. And one of the essays is by a sociologist about bringing up the issue of the basic income for all, and the critics and the pros and the cons, and why it is we can do it if we had the political will to do it, because we have the resources to do it. It's not that we don't have the resources.
Yes. And I have to say this. There was a guy who ran for president on this specific issue in 2020. His name was Andrew Yang, and his flagship, idea for his platform was the universal basic
Yeah,
income.
yeah,
So there's people who've done the math and figured out how we could do this and how much money would actually save us with homelessness services and different things that we don't have to spend money on anymore.
yeah,
When most people have, a roof over their head and food to eat.
yeah,
So that's so cool that you've done some editing on that and seen that as well.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's cool. Well, I think it's wonderful to end on this high note of where could we go? What are the solutions? I know that's something that Fromm wrote about as well. We need to have folks who are doing this type of research to try to figure out how can we shift things in a way that's going to be helpful for us and our own journeys to self-actualize.
Our worst enemy is despair. If we don't have models of hopefulness and we don't look at them and we start showing that these things are possible within our means, we can avoid uh, getting cynical and despairing. We need positive visions of the future, and for that we need Franz. Let me go back to his radical humanism. We need an ethics and a humanism that supports and values that supports societies that move in that direction.
Right, right. I think he's definitely sorely needed, and just thinking of the Fromm's idea of the revolution of hope. Sometimes hope has to exist even if you don't get to bear the fruits of its labors, right? And maybe other generations do, but hope has to start somewhere. So that's probably a good way to end there.
Yeah. Well, we so appreciate your time, Mauricio. Your fascinating, amazing history, amazing life experiences, connection with Fromm. So I'm excited. I was doing some research about you before we started, and I'm excited to order your book that you did with Maccabee and take a look at that because that's pretty cool. The prophetic, what is it called again?
Prophetic analyst.
The prophetic analyst. So I think I'll enjoy that one, and maybe we can do this again for the podcast for the Fromm Society.
Yeah. The last project I did with Maccabee was an edited book that we both wrote essays called Leadership, Psychoanalysis, and Society.
Wow.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much for being here. We had a blast.
Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Rudy.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll do this again soon. And we want to thank all of you for listening, for being a part of our episode. If you want to find out more information, you can search the Erich Fromm Society of North America. We hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
On behalf of all of us here at the Fromm Society of North America, we want to thank you for listening to today's episode of the Fromm Connection. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America, a group of individuals who are passionate about sharing the ideas of Erich Fromm. For more information, visit www.erichfrommna.com.